Welcome, everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started. We know other people may be joining, but thank you for spending some time, maybe over your lunch with us. We're thrilled to have you all here. Folks can go ahead and we'd love to get a sense of who's in the room and let you give each other a sense of who's in the room. So if you want to use the chat to just introduce yourself with name, organization, that would be appreciated. We are going to have about an hour here today, and we really want to make sure that we are answering your questions. So thank you for sending some questions in advance. We have a number of those on the next slide, and we kind of group these into themes that we were seeing. So we hope to answer many of these questions today. What is the dashboard? How is our region doing? Chief among those. And we have two upcoming events where we will spend time on some of the more future-oriented questions. The first is Compete on August 5th, where we'll be meeting hosted by the St. Paul and Minneapolis Chambers and really talking about how do we compete, what actions can we take as a region to grow our economy. We also have another webinar after Compete, and that will go deeper into some of the longer term trends that we're seeing in the region. So, lots of opportunities to learn and share. We do want to make sure we're also answering your questions today as we go through. So if you have questions, you can use the Q&A function in Zoom. You can also put them in the chat, but we're trying to keep the chat more for intros. And the Q&A can be found on that bottom bar. There's a more with three dots, and you should be able to click that and find Q&A. So that's our little bit of housekeeping. And again, thank you for spending some time with us. So today, we are going to talk just a little bit about the dashboard, a little bit about what has changed with the dashboard, and then get into, what are the emerging storylines that we're seeing in this year's data. So, Greater MSP. Why does Greater MSP do a dashboard? So a number of your questions prompted this. So one of Greater MSP's mission as the public-private partnership that is accelerating economic growth for the region is to have a deep understanding of how the region is doing. So we think about that question a lot. We really want to understand it. And we also are trying to figure out how we grow that economy, right? And what are those emerging opportunities? If we go on to the next slide, we see just some of the ways in which we are trying to build that next economy. So we really want to understand where we are today as a way to understand the foundation on which we can grow and go forward. So when we look at the next economy, we look at, areas where we have a lot of strength, like med and health tech, or next generation food and ag. And we also look at areas that are growing rapidly where we may have, a right to win or we're particularly competitive, like clean industry. So these are sectors that we've identified as opportunities for the region. And, we're working with many of you, with partners all across the region, across those sectors to help drive that forward. So that's kind of the context in which we're looking at the dashboard. So many of you will maybe have been with us last year when we did Compete and release the 2025 dashboard. We just wanted to remind everybody that year we had 10 years of data. That was the 10th year of collecting the dashboard. So we were able to look back a little further. And we kind of, there's a lot of data, but we distilled it into these four headlines. Excitingly, we had some promising signals on racial inclusion, but inequities remained. Housing and infrastructure, we identified as real assets for our livability. We're still a good place for workers last year. And, regional economic growth was slowing. The data this year has not undercut any of these headlines. These still remain largely true, although there's nuances. So we'll get more into, particularly on racial inclusion, some of the nuances there. And we have quite a bit more, I would say, new indicators on being still a good place for workers. So with that, I want to then just hit on why competitiveness matters. So, this may be a little bit obvious to some people, but I think it's still helpful to say out loud. We are, as a region, we are competing for growing companies, new jobs, and their investments. Those companies are competing with people in their sectors, right? And in some cases, if they're publicly traded, they have a fiduciary obligation to make good choices about where they are investing. And so they're comparing us to similar states, similarly, states maybe with similar weather or similar geographic advantages or similar concentrations of the industry they're in. And this is true both for companies in Minnesota and outside Minnesota. And so we, as a partnership that is looking to grow the economy, we pay a lot of attention to these factors that companies tell us they look at when they are trying to make these investment decisions. And so that is reflected on the dashboard and in the design and in some of the changes we've made, the updates we've made to the dashboard. It's also not the only thing that we measure on the dashboard. So there's also, the dashboard is really meant to be a holistic view of how we are doing as a region, but kind of filtered through this competitiveness to businesses mattering to our sort of long-term success and quality of life. So, for those of you who know are familiar with the dashboard, we just wanted to note that there's a few changes that we made to this year's dashboard. We refreshed it, and so we want to make sure we just go through these quickly so we all understand kind of the data that we will be seeing shortly. So this was kind of a year-long process, basically from last year's compete to today. And so really want to thank our data team who came together and helped us on some of the harder questions, really wrestling through, how to have this indicator and not that indicator, or how to fit everything on the dashboard and really how to interpret things. So just huge thank you to the time and expertise represented from the contributions of these individuals. And I see several of you on the call, so thank you for joining us today as well. So one of the biggest changes that you'll note as we go through the data is that we are now talking about our rank out of 50. So the prior dashboard had 12 peer regions. We were one of 12. And that was a good, benchmarking idea. When we started the dashboard in 2015, there wasn't as much benchmarking going on. And now we are able, both with kind of the skill and the number of reps we've had with the dashboard, but also with, better able to code and kind of AI and that sort of advancements, we're able to look at the top 50 largest US metro areas. So this means that it's a bit more of an objective set, right? It's obviously a much bigger set. There are cities in here that we might not necessarily consider peers if you're wanting to be really literal about peers, but it does help us understand kind of where do we stack up among all large regions in the United States. So it's a little bit better, we hope, gauge of kind of where we're doing and where we could improve, or potentially help uncover regions we could really learn from that maybe we have flown beneath the radar because we haven't thought of them as peers in the past. And then another change was we added in a few new categories and we refreshed a number of indicators. And I'm not going to walk through all the indicators we added, but the categories really helped help clarify some of the way that we are having different conversations in the region, right? So we now have an affordability category, which has several new metrics, but also had metrics that were from an old, like the former dashboard's livability category. We also have a business vitality category that we've added. as well as, I'm sorry, an economic growth category that we added, as well as economic inclusion is now its own category. So the categories we're hoping help people navigate to topics that are really important to them, but also help us raise up those topics and have them be part of a dialogue. And then finally, we were able to, just have a deeper look at some trends around inclusion. So instead of kind of looking at gaps between, in this example from the prior version of the dashboard, from white workers and workers of color, we now have median wages, overall, and then broken out in those five uh, groups. So it's a little more to read, perhaps, but we think that having that level of nuance is going to ultimately be more informative and lead to good discussions. So those are some of the changes we've seen with the dashboard. And now, again, we're going to move into emerging stories. So again, nothing, those headlines that we saw from Compete last year are still largely true, and we're adding more nuance and deepening our understanding of them with this year's data. And so for that conversation, I'm going to turn it over to Nathan. And again, please do put your questions in the Q&A, and we will either, call on you or try to answer them in the chat function of Zoom as well.
Thanks, Julia. It's great to see everybody, or rather, see your names. I can't see all of your faces. I'm Nathan Arnosti, Director of Research and Intelligence here at Greater MSP, and we wanted to go over some of the emerging stories that we're seeing in this year's data. As Julia has mentioned, there's some long-running trends that are still true, but we think there's some really interesting insights that we want to get into this year that we've observed. So before getting into our analysis and what we're finding, we wanted to actually start with a little bit of an interactivity. We're going to start with a quiz and ask, for the folks in this webinar, how well do you know our region, right? There's a couple data points we wanted to test and share with you. So, Lauren, if you can hear me, let's bring up that first question on living wages. And you'll see a poll pop up and choose the answer that you think is right, and then we'll show everybody what the responses are. All right, we got 40 responses already. Let's get a couple more seconds. Get your question, your guesses in. Okay, great. And Lauren, I think you can show the results for this one. Okay, so there was kind of an even split. People guessing 50%, 70%. The correct answer is 70%. So 70% of full-time workers in this region earn enough to support themselves. One person, zero children. Okay. Next question is on family sustaining wages, and here we should say a family sustaining wage is defined as the wage required to support two adults and two children if both adults are working. And these are using the MIT Living Wage calculator. So, guess what do you think the right answer is here for MSP? All right, getting some good responses in. Let's give it another few seconds. All right, and we're gonna close it and see the results. All right, so the guess, as you can see, it looks like a lot of people thought 68%, which I love the optimism of that, just a couple of points off of the living wage jobs. What we find is about half of jobs in this region pay enough, according to the MIT Living Wage Calculator, if you're working full time to support a family. So there's a substantial drop off, as you can see. We can talk more about how we stack up, but broadly speaking, 70% living wage jobs is really good. That we're fourth across all of these peer metros. For family sustaining wages, we're not that. We're in the 30s. So we'll talk more about that. Let's go on to our next quiz. We've got I think four more of these, so we'll just keep trying these. So let's go to the regional job access by car. Lauren. Okay, so what percentage of our region's jobs can be reached in 30 minutes by a typical resident by car? Right. Last few seconds to get those guesses in. Okay, and Lauren, I think we can show results. Okay, so the correct answer is 58%. So more than half of jobs can be accessed in this region if you've got a car driving 30 minutes. Um, okay, and that is around the middle of the pack. We're about 22nd overall across the top 50 metro areas in terms of access to jobs by car. All right, now let's try that, but for transit. Okay, so the this is light rail and bus systems. How many of the region's jobs do you think we can access if if you've got 30 minutes by transit? Okay, we can close this poll. A lot of people are thinking 10%, 25%, 45%. The correct answer is actually less than 1%, right? So it's about 8.8% of jobs can be reached by public transit. I think the other thing that is remarkable to me about this stat is that we are right in the middle of the pack in terms of the top 50 metro areas. So there are places like New York, of course, and San Francisco, where you can access about 3 or 4% of jobs at max by transit. So I think this gives a good illustration of, how accessible jobs are based on these different infrastructure means. Okay, we've got the last pair. Let's bring up the 3-year graduation rate, Lauren. Okay, so what percentage of students at 2-year colleges graduate within 3 years? Is the question. And this is for all 2-year, colleges and universities in our metro area. All right, last couple seconds to get your guesses in. And okay, go ahead and share the results, Lauren. So we're seeing kind of a modal distribution right around 63%. It's actually 38%, right? So just 38% of students at 2-year colleges graduate within 3 years. Um, that is 43rd out of 50. So that's pretty strikingly low. And we're trailing places like Seattle, where 76% of students at 2-year colleges graduate. Okay. And then the last question is 6-year college graduation. Or yeah, so this is the students going to 4-year institutions. What percentage graduate within 6 years? And take a second to answer this one. All right. Got good number of responses so far. We're going to give it a couple more seconds for people to get their guesses in. This is the final one. How well do you know this region? Okay, and we are going to show the results. And what we see is that actually 76%, most people were guessing in that 63%, 51%. Turns out actually 3/4 of students who enter 4-year colleges and universities in this region graduate within 6 years. And that is best among the top 50 metro areas. So thank you, Lauren, for this experiment. Thanks to all of you for participating in this and to kind of see how well we test our regional knowledge. We can close the poll now. And I'm going to just show the results here on my screen. Let me see if this goes through. So these are what we're finding in the dashboard, and this is how you'll see it in the dashboard that's going to be available. If you're joining us on Compete on August 5th, you'll get a hard copy at your table. It will also be available online starting August 5th. And so these were some things that really stood out to us and seemed to be really interesting and novel insights from this year's dashboard. We're seeing highly competitive share of workers earning living wages, but not for family sustaining wages, which for reasons we'll get into. We're seeing kind of middle of the pack job access by car and by transit, but huge variation in terms of how many jobs you can reach by each of these modes of transportation. and also a really substantial difference in the share of students graduating at two-year institutions versus four-year institutions in this region. Okay. All right. Well, with that, let's move on to the kind of analysis that we're seeing, the storylines that we think are really defining in this year's dashboard. So we have five that we'll kind of walk through sequentially. First is we find that in this year's dashboard results, our region's quality of life remains nationally leading. Second, our slow growth trend is continuing, so we'll show some of the stats related to that. Third, and this is what Julia was referencing initially, we're seeing some really concerning regression on economic inclusion. We'll talk more about what we're seeing over this past year. Uh, Fourth, we're seeing stagnation on affordability, right? That this is not actually the most affordable region, and I'm sure that will not be a surprise to all of you who are, purchasing goods and services, every day in this region. And fifth, we'll talk about kind of a positive bright spot story, which is that we've been reclaiming our standing as a destination for young people in this region. Okay. So first, what are the data points that we're seeing that go into this understanding of our region's quality of life? It's worth noting that out of these 50 metro areas, a top 10 ranking is a really impressive stat, right? There's, all sorts of geographies, all sorts of regions, all sorts of economic dimensions. And we can see that, this region is best in terms of the population that can access parks. It's second best among the population that volunteered in the past year. We've got very high share of the population that has commutes of less than 30 minutes. We are a great arts and entertainment hub. We actually have more arts and entertainment workers per capita than places like New York and San Francisco, which might be surprising to some folks. Economically, financially, we're also seeing some really, really unique strengths, right? In this region, more women work and have paid employment, age 16 to 64, than any other region in the United States. We're seeing, as mentioned, a really high share of workers, about 70% of workers earning enough to support themselves. We're seeing a relatively low share of households that are cost burdened, which means they spend 30% of their income or more on rent. Now, of course, you could say that that number could still be a lot lower, right? We don't want to have one in three people still be cost burdened, but that's actually very competitive and better than most of our peer regions. And in this new measure, we're looking at the kind of the ratio between high income earners and low income earners, and we find that this region has one of the best ratios, which means that it is the least unequal in terms of the wage distribution between those kind of high earners earning about 4.5 times more than low earners. Okay, so that's the first point that we're seeing. Second one is that our slow growth trend is continuing. So what are we seeing when we see that, right? So population growth has grown about 6.6%. We're 37th out of 50 on this, and we're declining in rank. Yearly job growth, which often tracks very closely with population growth, we're 35th. It's grown by less than 1%. We're also falling in rank there. GDP growth, we've seen a slight uptick. We're actually gaining rank, but we're still around the middle of the pack on GDP. Other signals, unemployment rate, we've actually dropped 9 spots from one year to the next. We're seeing a rising unemployment rate in Minnesota and certainly in the MSP region. And it is worth noting for this data that this is all data dating back to 2025. So this would not actually capture the impacts of Metro Surge earlier this year. We anticipate when that is factored into the upcoming year, we'll see additional destabilization and additional downward trends for this. Venture capital, we actually have attracted companies in this region attracted less venture capital than they did the previous year. We've dropped a rank to 19th. And we actually have one of the lowest rates of starting new businesses per 1,000 residents across the top 50 metro areas. So all of these are really sobering trends that we're noticing. We're not in the top 10 land here, right? We're in areas that we're certainly not leading across the country, and we're losing ground on most of these measures. Places like Miami, Las Vegas, Raleigh, certainly for venture capital, San Francisco, New York, Boston, and new establishments, places like California and Missouri. These are all areas that are really showing a lot more economic activity and positive trends in these measures. Okay, regression on economic inclusion. Well, I think there's a story that's probably very familiar to many of us on this call about how to understand economic inclusion in this region, which is that when you look at the top line numbers, our region oftentimes performs incredibly well, right? You can see we've got the fifth highest employment rate, we've got the seventh highest median worker wages, third lowest poverty rate. These are really impressive aggregate numbers, but of course, part of what we wanted to do, as Julia was mentioning, is disaggregate this data so we have a better understanding of how these trends are affecting different communities in our region, especially given the history of kind of long, persistent structural inequities. So when we disaggregate this data, a different picture emerges, especially from the last year. And you can just step back and see that that color scheme that we have of red meaning trending in the wrong direction, green meaning trending in the right direction, there's a lot more red that you can see here than green. So we're seeing across the board declines in employment rate for Asian, Black, Hispanic, Native American, and white workers. Uh, Compare that to places like Nashville, where Black employment is 75%, Salt Lake City, where Hispanic employment is 78%, right? Uh, Native American employment in DC is 76%, right? So there's the other regions where different communities are even more attached to the labor market. You see a similar story in median wages, right? So actually declines for Asian, Hispanic, and Native American median wages year over year. Just in the past year, this is 2024 data to 2025 data, and we think that's really certainly really concerning. Places that are really leading on median wages. DC, Austin, San Diego are seeing some of the highest Black median worker wages. Philadelphia, DC, San Diego, also really good for Native American wages and Hispanic wages as well. So there's these certain regions that are enabling greater access and connectivity to the region's labor market. And of course, with third grade reading levels, this is statewide data, so we don't have comparative results. We're not able to do benchmarking for that measure, but this has been a longstanding measure, and we're seeing some really concerning not only level disparities, but also declines in just the absolute performance of the share of the students that are achieving reading standards in third grade. So all of these are really troubling trends and worth recognizing that we are in a different moment in terms of racial equity than we even were a year or two ago when we first shared that first headline. Okay, the fourth headline we're seeing is stagnating affordability with high costs, especially for families. So the cost of living index is a long established index that essentially offers a single number to compare affordability on all sorts of things, utilities, groceries, housing, travel, transportation, right? And what we find is that out of the top 50 metro areas, the MSP region ranks 25th, right? We're right in the middle of the pack. It will not be familiar, not be surprising, I think, to many of you that this region is more affordable than a lot of those metros on the coast. You can see those dark blue bubbles in California and the Pacific Northwest and the Northeast. But one thing that we're really tracking and think is really important to understand is there's a lot of metro areas in the Midwest and this very fast-growing South that are on par with or even more affordable and offer a better value for their dollar than the MSP region. So places like Kansas City is third best on cost of living. Columbus is sixth. Austin, Raleigh, Dallas, right? These are all places that actually offer a lower cost of living when across all of these different factors. And this matters, of course, for families and individuals. It also matters for businesses and thinking about where do we want to relocate, where do we want to invest and expand. If the MSP region is not a cost competitive region, we're going to see that investment go elsewhere, and there's going to be all sorts of downstream effects that are very challenging for us. Okay, and then the fifth headline that we wanted to share is that there is a positive story here on reclaiming this region's standing as a destination for young adults, right? So one thing we've tracked for many years now is that net migration, moving out, is subtracted from those who move in the past year of young adults aged 25 to 34. And what we find is that while overall migration actually declined a little bit across the board, there's still plus 12,000 young adults that moved into this region then moved out just in the past year. And as a result of that, we moved from 21st to 13th in a year. We're seeing positive momentum, and we're now in this top 13 group of metros. So we're really on par in terms of net migration with Denver, with Detroit, with Portland. There's other regions that would want to be in our position if you understand that, young adults oftentimes are the ones, starting new ventures, offering new ideas, right? Maybe returning home to be close to family, right? There's all of these benefits of being a destination for young adults. We're actually attracting more young adults on net than Los Angeles, than Salt Lake City, than San Diego or Boston. And of course, for those wanting to look kind of further up, what are the places that are attracting the most young adults? Well, we find Dallas, Seattle, Chicago are all attracting 25,000 plus young adults on net per year. And so that is substantially more than MSP. So there's a bit of a positive story, and I think to really understand this positive story, it's worth looking back over a couple of years of data, right? So during the pandemic, for those following along, and Axios actually wrote a really great analysis of this just today. Um, there has been uh, net out migration outflow around the pandemic years of young adults, but also of many other age cohorts. And what we've been seeing is over these past number of years, the MSP region is rebounding. We're getting back to, or maybe even surpassing, this status as being a destination of net migration for young adults. And you can see, the other age cohorts all have, a little bit different curves. And it's worth noting that that young adult, that 25 to 34 year cohort, is really, really significant. It's a higher source of new residents than any other cohort, age cohort we see, and therefore it's really valuable and very important to make sure that that cohort is continuing to be welcomed and to be drawn here for the opportunities and the quality of life that we offer. Okay, so those are the five headlines, and for those wanting to kind of sum up this, what do we take away from this? What are all of the different ways to read this? This is a kind of way that we have been testing to frame what the storylines are coming out of the dashboard. On the left side, you can see that our region continues to rank very high on quality of life. Great high life expectancy, great parks, shorter commutes, hub of arts and entertainment. And this is something that many of us have benefited from. Of course, there have been, deep inequities, but there are very strong metrics for this region across the board on those measures. On the right, what would be what you might consider our future, right? There's some really troubling signs that we're seeing on economic growth. We're seeing that it continues to slow. We're seeing slowing job growth, lagging household income growth, rising unemployment, venture capital investments going down. And we think at Greater MSP that it's really hard to have a top quality of life if you don't have a top-notch economy that's innovative and prosperous and inclusive. So this is a little bit of it's more than a warning signal. It's really a kind of flashing red light that we should all be understanding that if we really care about maintaining that quality of life that we're seeing on the left, we need to be thinking about those future indicators as well. Okay. That I think concludes the data and storylines that we wanted to share. So I think we will now move to Q&A and take a look at the chat, and you feel free to add your questions in the Q&A function. All right, thank you. And thanks, Julia, for answering some of these questions already. That's great.
Yeah, for those who may be on the phone, it may be helpful to answer the one about what is the living wage and what's the difference between living wage and family sustaining wage.
Yep.
Just to spend a little time on that because I imagine other
Yeah.
people have the question.
Yes, absolutely. So, Julie, do you want? Yeah, I'll take a stab at it. And I see you already have written some thoughts there too. So the MIT Living Wage Calculator is a long-running, well-established calculator that estimates what wage you need to earn kind of a basic to meet your basic living expenses. So each year they'll update their data based on the kind of basket of goods and costs that household sizes of different types can reach. And so what we've done this year is identify two different definitions, right, of family sustaining and living wages, right? So a living wage means you, as an individual, earn enough working full time to support yourself. And as Julia was mentioning, that's about $24.50 an hour, $50,000 or so a year. Um, and what we also find is that for family sustaining wages, you need to earn a little bit more to be able to support, two kids and childcare costs and other expenses. And that is around $33, $34 an hour. So closer to $70,000 a year for that family sustaining wage. Um, and so that is, yeah, go ahead, Julia.
No, no, keep going.
Oh, oh, great. So that kind of explains mechanically why you're seeing a higher share of workers in the region that earn enough to support themselves. There's a lower share of workers, about half of workers, that earn enough to be able to support a family. And we wanted to do this in part to recognize that there's different family sizes and household sizes in this region. I think we ran the analysis, and Aaron Olson at StrataSite ran the analysis for us earlier this year to say something like 30% of
And has been a real source of talent and workforce for the region historically. And then let's see.
so I see a
Do you want
question.
to, while we're on migration, do you want to go back to the slide that shows the different age groups by migration? And maybe it looks
Yes.
like,
Yeah.
Eric, do you want to add on anything?
Yeah.
Oh, Matt's chiming in too on 45 to 55-year-olds.
Yes, yeah,
Yeah.
and I would say we've shared this with our data team who tracks these migration trends very closely too, and we've found consistently, right, that the 45 to 55 category is negative. So this is not necessarily just a last several years dynamic. An Axios study that found that very similarly, and I would say absolutely, Eric, it is a concern. I don't know if there's any age group that you would say we are totally fine with having, net negative migration, right? We ideally would want to be a destination for people of every age group, and this is a concern that I think is worth asking. And I'd love your additional thoughts and additional thinking on uh, what can be done to reverse that.
I mean, I think to also to Matt Lewis's point in the chat, it's a little hard to see the scale on this, but 45 to 54-year-olds tend to be less mobile. So yes, it is negative, and again, it's hard to see the scale. It's just not as many individuals moving around.
That's
Although
right.
we'd love to have it be positive.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just going through the chat and then I'll go back to the Q&A as well.
I see a question from Mark Miller Jr. It would be interesting to see the difference between single and family median income. So I think that's a really good observation, and it points to something that's really distinctive about this region, which is, as you'd seen, 79% of women aged 16 to 64 in this region have paid employment, right? This is a region of dual income earners, right? That is the predominant dynamic among couples who are married, and therefore that enables this region to have higher household incomes overall. When you have two income earners, that tends to boost household earnings, and that is a real driver of why this region has historically had higher median household incomes than you might expect. So it is a really good question, though, Mark, and certainly worth noting that for the households that do not have two income earners, you're in a much more difficult place in terms of affordability and ability to pay for your life without that.
I see two other questions. One in the Q&A around from Terry White saying, "What do you attribute the slowdown in job growth to?" And that is a great question. That is actually the sole subject of the webinar after Compete. So I don't mean to, I'll give a preview, but we will spend, about an hour really digging into what we're thinking are the root causes of slow growth. Some of them link back to demographics, population change, really big, big moving parts of the, not even economy, but sort of the population. There's also some thoughts that we have around productivity and, where productivity is moving, both in our region and in the country, and in the ability to start and sustain new companies. So those are some of those underlying root causes. They're really complex. They're very interconnected. And so, the next webinar will have more time to go into it, and you can see sort of some of the initial hypotheses, right? I think this is something that we've spent the last 8, 9 months thinking about, and we're still really trying to make sure that we are going deep enough to understand that in a way that we can feel confident, moving forward and trying to take action against it.
And if someone on the Greater MSP team could drop a link to that webinar, it's August 19th at noon to 1. So we'd love to see you there. It's free. It'll be a similar, webinar system like this. I'm seeing a question from D'Angelos Svenkason. Are there any major correlations that data reveals regarding economic growth, population change, and regression in economic inclusion? It's a really good question. I think for the reasons that Julia was mentioning, there's a lot of moving parts here, right? If you just think about in the past year or two, there are many, many different things that are happening all at once, right? Whether it's, AI and data centers to, Trump tariffs to, federal, pullback on, DEI initiatives, and cutback of different programs, right? There's all of these different factors that all are happening simultaneously. That makes it very difficult, to really fully parse exactly what's happening. But I think broadly speaking, yes, I think we can say, for one, there's, studying past recessions shows that workers of color tend to be last in and first out of the labor market, right? They're the last to see their unemployment rates drop down, and they're the first ones to see that unemployment rate spikes when the economy slows down. So there's a very strong reason why a strong economy is beneficial for economic inclusion. Um, and I think that also holds true for things like income, right? And wages, that if you see slowing job growth and slowing GDP growth, overall, you're not creating the same wealth and prosperity that then can be translated into worker wages. So much more to dig into. And I think D'Angelo's, I know you and I, and we have all been talking about these issues quite a lot and look forward to more conversation on them. But I think you're right to name that there is a link from what we understand, between those.
Let's see. I'm seeing a question about startups and VC as well as teenage workforce. Growing new startups and VC investing, again, is one of those really complicated areas. I know Matt Lewis, who was on, had to jump, but he's really internally our senior leader on that. So we have a whole effort around growing startup and VC investing. I think one of the things we are seeing is that there's a lot we can learn from other regions in that space. We are growing our startup community, we are growing VC investment, and other regions are doing it more quickly. I think Denver often comes to mind for folks as a place that's really growing that. And there's a lot we can learn from a region like Columbus or, some cities that maybe don't have as much of a well-known startup culture yet, but are really aggressively figuring out, what can be done to start that. I think as we've kind of reflected on this, and again, this is kind of, I would encourage you to go follow Matt Lewis on LinkedIn, who posts about this kind of regularly. But one opportunity for us is really to think about how do we not just start startups? We obviously need that, but how do we get them to scale and take them into, being that kind of mid-market company, and then, I guess ultimately becoming maybe a unicorn or whatever, if that's their desire. But how do you get startups from startup, small company, small business to scale? And I think that's really a place where the VC investment is critically important, but also just kind of retooling how we have been supporting startups to learn from other regions who are doing that better. Great. And then we've got teenage workforce. I don't know. Do you want to take that one, Nathan? We don't really go into the teenage workforce a ton.
Yeah, we don't. I mean, I think that there's, for as many indicators as we track on the dashboard, there's many others that really matter, right? And I think we have something like 80 plus indicators now that we're tracking across these 50 metro areas. we don't specifically track teenage workforce, but I would say that that fits into this bucket that we are seeing rising concerns around, over the last number of years, right? You're seeing, increases in uh, teenage unemployment and decreases in labor force participation for teenagers, certainly compared to, a couple decades ago when we were teenagers ourselves. And I think that that also fits into a kind of an emerging and new challenge related to AI, right? Which is to think about, we're seeing some softening of the labor market demand for young adults, even college graduates just leaving the labor market. And there's some speculation, and I think with some reason that the big companies that used to hire a lot of these, workers right out of college are not hiring quite as many. And so there's real challenges that young people and teenagers are facing in today's labor market. All right. And I can't see others in the chat or questions, but I appreciate these questions and please keep them coming.
I'm not seeing anything in Q&A, and not seeing anything new in the chat either.
Oh, I see a question from D'Angelo's. Anything to highlight regarding younger populations not choosing Minnesota? So that's a really interesting one. And I love that we're coming back to this, net migration stat because I do think it's really interesting and it has always kind of captivated people's attention. You want to be a place that is a destination for young people. What we see, and this is true across the state of Minnesota, and it's been true for a couple decades, is a massive outmigration of young adults, specifically who are age 18, right? And so it's essentially college-bound high school students. If you think about all of the colleges in this region, right? Iowa State, University of Wisconsin-Madison, North Dakota State, South Dakota State, right? There's these big state schools that are drawing a lot of really well-educated, very qualified high school students in Minnesota out to those universities. And so we think that that's part of what is driving that kind of big exodus of 18-year-olds that Minnesota's had for a long time. Um, and one thing that is really a kind of flip side of the coin that we benefit from is that when Minnesotan high school students go off to colleges outside of the state of Minnesota, many of them will end up returning, right? They'll come back, they'll work at the companies and find opportunities here in the Twin Cities. And that is part of what drives this positive net migration of that 25 to 34 year cohort. So that has been one of these kind of structural dynamics just based on the where geographically, these major state schools are, that we think is driving that exodus of 18-year-old young adults. So it's a really good question. Yeah. Well, I think we can certainly go to the kind of next steps and give you a sense of just a couple things to look forward to in the coming weeks and answer any last questions that you have. But broadly speaking, a couple things to look forward to, which is, for one, we've got a compete event on August 5th. Please register for that. I assume many of you are, and we'd love to see you there. We ask that you activate, connect, call in more leaders to build a more competitive regional economy at Compete. We're going to be talking a little bit about the data. We're also going to be talking about what the Greater MSP Partnership across this region is doing to build a more competitive economy. So we'd love to have you plug in and think about, all of these ways that we can move some of the trends in a more positive direction. And then, as Julia had mentioned, for people who are wanting to go deeper, to ask about these kind of root causes and why are we seeing this slow growth trend emerge in the last number of years, we will have a webinar dedicated to that on August 19th. We'd love to see you there. And I think we can drop some links in the chat for that as well.
Mhm.
Okay, with that said, I'm
Yeah.
seeing two other questions. Go ahead, Julia. Yeah.
Yeah, so I just dropped the link for Compete in the chat, which is the event in person live August 5th? Oh, great. Thanks. And Aisha dropped in a little more of a blurb on there, so that's great. It's a breakfast event. It'll get you ready and excited for the day. And then I see a question in the Q&A that we'll try to do in the last 4 minutes. How many formal inclusion efforts have been underway? Oh, excuse me. That's a really hard question to answer. There are a lot of formal and I would imagine informal inclusion efforts underway. And I think one of the things we were seeing in the data last year was that, some of these promising signs on inclusion was really, it felt like, all these efforts across public, private, philanthropic, university, lots of different sectors had efforts. We were part of I get the acronym wrong, but the Minnesota Coalition on Racial Equity. That was more of a private sector effort, as an example. And it felt like last year we were starting to see positive signs from those efforts at a local, state level. I think what we're starting to see now, and again, this is 1 year of data and we need to, keep monitoring it and make sure that we're tracking it. But, there's been a real change at the federal level. Thank you, Minnesota Business Coalition for Racial Equity. But that our local efforts were seemed to be making progress, and then there was a change at the federal level, and that's difficult, right? I'm not trying to excuse, what's happening at the local level or the need to ensure that we double down and continue on that. But I think one of the things we want to understand better is just how to make progress in a federal environment that is really changed from, what we were seeing in the data last year. So that's one thing.
Yeah. Mark
Yeah.
has a question on one of the other interesting stats I think would be important is how big the overall gaps in income are. We know the top earners are nowhere near the medium. I'm willing to bet I haven't seen any real data that there isn't a lot of stratification in between either. That would be an interesting stat to see. So yeah, I agree with that, and I think one of the things that we found um, with one of the indicators that we recently added, which is the 90th to 10th percentile income ratio, is it gets a little bit at that stratification. And one thing we found is that we're, I think, a top 20 region in terms of the top level incomes, right? So that 90th percentile means you're earning about $160,000 a year as an individual, right? So top 20 there, still relatively high. But one of the things that really allows us to perform so well in this measure is at the bottom, that 10th percentile of the income is actually much higher than other regions. So there have been real efforts to boost earnings and increase wages for people at the 10th percentile. I think it's around 35,000. So the 10th percentile earner is earning about $30,000 to $35,000 a year. So because that's a higher floor and a not stratospherically high ceiling, the ratio is actually pretty low. So yeah, thanks for that question.
Yep. Great. Well, we are going to sneak in. We want to make sure we get you out of here in time, but both Nathan and I are happy to answer questions. You can find our email both on the Greater MSP website is probably the easiest way, but we're both first name, last name at greatermsp.org. First name dot last name at greatermsp.org. So again, thank you for spending time today with us to better understand the region, and we hope to see you at Compete or at the webinar we're hosting in August.
Thank you. Take care.